Hello everyone, and thanks for watching. Well, they finally released the memo. If you're watching this, you probably know what I'm talking about, but just in case, let me give a quick breakdown. Recently, the House Intelligence Committee voted to release a memo that questions the legitimacy of the investigation into Trump's supposed ties to Russia. The vote passed, and the memo was sent to the president for approval. Trump approved the release of the memo, which became public on February 2nd, 2018. Meanwhile, the Democrats have written their own 10-page memo, which is meant to serve as a rebuttal to the original memo, but is yet to be released since it references classified information and therefore needs approval to be declassified and released to the public. But if the memo is accurate, then it makes perfect sense to want to release it and make it public as soon as possible because the information paints a picture of corruption within the Department of Justice and FBI. This is unfortunate any way you look at it because if the intelligence agencies have information that isn't public, then the only way we can learn the truth is from politicians who decide to have that information released. But another problem here is that it could be used to release limited information that could create a false narrative. So either way, we're at the mercies of our politicians and bureaucracies, which isn't something that I'm happy about at all. But that's a topic for another time. Before the memo was released, several Republican congressmen who had been allowed to read the memo took to Twitter to express outrage for what was contained in it. So we can ask ourselves, why would they do this if it wasn't true? Well, first off, the memo was an internal memo, so it's entirely possible for someone within the committee to raise concerns about the investigation, and for those concerns to be addressed later. In which case, the matter may have been resolved, meaning the person raising the concern didn't have complete and accurate information, and then after voicing their concern was given that information, which settled the matter and put their mind at ease. If that was the case, then everything that happened after the memo was written would have been relevant and yet left out. So in other words, the memo may have been one or a few people's opinions and not based on facts. However, it's also possible that the information in the memo was true, but rather that the Republicans didn't understand the implications and therefore expressed their concern that wasn't necessary. We see politicians making much ado about nothing all the time, so it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But anyways, after the situation was made public, hashtag release the memo started trending on Twitter. It became a big headline and the media started creating their own narrative. The gist being that the memo is just a distraction in order to discredit the Russia investigation. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi went on CNN before the memo was released to address her concerns, which can be summed up with two ideas. The first was that the memo was made up to push a narrative, and the other was that the memo could reveal classified information and therefore should not be released. But to me, this comes off as somewhat contradictory. I mean, it is possible that the memo contained secrets but otherwise was fake. For example, if it had been cherry-picked and taken out of context, then it's entirely possible that the memo contained information that was real, but still painted a false picture of reality. Or similarly, if the memo had been doctored, it could be that the author used real people and events in order to give it more credibility, but otherwise made up the rest of the information. But to me, this seems more like me explaining away the inconsistencies in the Democrats' narrative rather than a truly coherent idea, but I don't really know for sure. And unfortunately, Pelosi couldn't elaborate more because if she had, it could have been trouble if she accidentally revealed classified information. So her lack of clarity at least makes sense. But now let's consider the implications of the memo. If the memo is true, then this was the Intelligence Committee coming together in a bipartisan way to inform the American people of a crime that attempted to circumvent our democracy. However, this seems somewhat unlikely since the votes to release the memo fell completely on partisan lines. However, that doesn't mean that a few individuals weren't acting in the best interest of the public and putting their politics aside, but there's no real evidence to support this either, so I wouldn't bet on it. But if the memo isn't entirely accurate, which could mean that it was either altered in some way or simply that the information in the memo is incomplete, either way that would mean that this was an overreaction and that the committee was being influenced by their own political bias. In which case, it is not a bipartisan effort to inform the public, but either was a simple error or was a deliberate partisan attempt to undermine certain institutions. CNN and the mainstream media narrative is that Trump is attempting to undermine the Russia investigation. The claim is that if he calls into question Rod Rosenstein's impartiality, then he can use that as a way to remove him without suspicion and bring in someone who will impede the Mueller investigation into Trump's supposed ties to Russia. I think it's worth mentioning, however, that even if the memo is shown to be false or misleading in some way, that doesn't prove anything in regards to Trump and Russia. For one, because it's possible, and in my opinion probable, that Trump didn't actually read the memo, so he wasn't attempting to undermine anyone, he was just being used. Furthermore, Trump has stated that he doesn't plan on removing Rosenstein. And of course, the most damning bit of info about the Russia investigation, which is that while we know Russia meddled in our election, we have no evidence of Trump colluding with Russia. So unless there's more classified intelligence that shows otherwise, as far as the American public has been informed, the Russia investigation has not been proven, and the entire thing seems to be predicated on seemingly flimsy accusations, and then was blown out of proportion by CNN and other news outlets that saw it as a way to get ratings.
Then why is CNN constantly like Russia this, Russia that?
Because it's ratings.
Because it's ratings?
Our ratings are incredible right now.
So what exactly does the memo say? I'll leave a link in the description in case you haven't read it yet, but basically the memo makes several claims. 1, that Christopher Steele had conflicts of interest with the DNC and Hillary Clinton. 2, that the Steele dossier was the reason for the Trump investigation. 3, that Steele was in contact with the media, in particular Yahoo News. 4, that Steele had a friendly relationship with Orr, which was concealed from the FBI. And 5, that there was no connection between Page and Papadopoulos. There's, of course, more to the memo than just that, but those are the pieces of information that I found most relevant. So let's look at these one at a time and see if there's anything else that can be said about each one of these claims. The first claim is that Christopher Steele had conflicts of interest with the DNC and Hillary Clinton, which seems true, but the memo only really claims that the role of the DNC and Hillary Clinton hadn't been addressed in the FISA application, which leaves open the possibility that the application included the conflicts of interest and the payments themselves, they just didn't include Hillary's involvement, which, if the application included the conflicts of interest, then the judge may have decided that any of the information from the Steele dossier would need to be independently corroborated and verified, and so therefore the actual conflict of interest, who it was with, would have been irrelevant because the conflict would have already been disclosed, and so they wouldn't be relying on that information anyway. So specifically who was doing the paying wouldn't have really been relevant. Then it claims Steele was in contact with the media, in particular Yahoo News. This is true, and as the memo states, his reliability came into question and his role as informant was terminated with the FBI, so there's not really an issue there. And then Steele had a friendly relationship with Orr, which was concealed from the FBI. This seems misleading too because Orr was never part of the investigation, and so was never part of the FISA application. So there's not really a problem there either. And then the memo states that there was no connection between Page and Papadopoulos, which is again true, but Page wasn't the reason for the Trump investigation. As the memo states, Papadopoulos was the reason for the Trump investigation. So again, there's not really an issue there either. So what does all this mean? Well, what I think it means is that while it's true that Steele became unreliable and had conflicts of interest, it's possible that the information reported on the FISA application included the existence of the conflicts that were alone enough to require independent verification from the information in the dossier before being entered into evidence. This would make the specifics of the conflict irrelevant because nothing from Steele was used as evidence on its own. But this goes against what the memo claims, which is that Deputy Director McCabe testified before the committee in December 2017 that no surveillance warrant would have been sought from the FISA without the Steele dossier information. However, the exact wording of this has been disputed, and it's been claimed that he was saying that the FISA application must be looked at as a whole, and therefore, if any part of it was falsified, it could have been affected the application process. But it has been suggested that even without the Steele dossier, the Russian investigation would have been conducted anyway, so who really knows? So what's the verdict? Well, the honest truth is I just don't know. Could the memo be true and reveal problems inside our government? It certainly seems possible. If nothing else, it seems to suggest that our institutions can fall victim to bias. Now, if those departments are made up of individuals with competing interests and ideologies, then maybe they can maintain a fair bipartisan balance, but then again, maybe not. So maybe we need a better way to hold these people accountable, since the information that proves guilt, and consequently information that could clear someone of guilt as well, is usually classified. And so as a result, people who aren't inside these institutions will have no way of knowing for certain one way or another. And so our only option is to trust someone to tell us the truth, which I'm not comfortable with, considering that I don't trust the Republicans or the Democrats, nor do I trust the mainstream media in general. I think that the Democrats could have done a better job of supporting the memo for the purpose of transparency, and that may have made me more sympathetic to their explanation. But as it stands now, it seems that they simply wanted to conceal the truth. But on the other hand, the Republicans who rushed to have the memo released seem to be too concerned with informing the public of something that was far short of a smoking gun, and in fact proves little to nothing at all on its own. But don't get me wrong, it certainly does look bad. In fact, it looks so bad that the Dow plummeted the same day. Now, the memo is only partly to blame, though. Expectations of higher interest rates played a much larger factor, but when trust in the United States government falls, trust in the dollar falls. And unfortunately, one of the biggest drivers of the stock market is investor confidence, so the stock market has suffered as a result. However, usually political uncertainty or really any sort of big change in stock price tends to lead to overreaction by the market, which over time evens out a little when everything calms down a bit. So much of the fall in stock will likely recover in the next few days, especially when you take into account that the market was plummeting before the release of the memo. So now that the memo has been released, my guess is that things will settle down a bit. But that's it for today. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below. I plan to talk more about this topic in the future. I'll probably make a video about the Democrat memo once that gets released. But for now, I think all we can do is let cooler heads prevail and remember to never stop questioning.